Welcome to this Master Thesis Defense Seminar at Lund University's Department of Sociology. We're going to show you today both how to defend your master thesis and how to act as an opponent within a thesis defense. The example we'll be using is Tolia Jack's master thesis entitled Nobody Was Dirty, Disrupting Inconspicuous Consumption in Laundry Routines. Normally, the first word in the defense will go to the author, who will have a chance to mention any omissions or printing errors that came out in the latest version of the text. Then we will hand it to our opponent, Henriette Eshold, who will start with a summary of the thesis, followed by specific questions. Then there will be a discussion that will go back and forth between the opponent and the author. This is an example of a thesis defense conducted in the right way.
So, I don't have too much to add before we get started. There's a spelling error on page 7 and another couple on 14 and 21, and a few of the page numbers dropped from my references, but I've taken note of this and it will be updated in the final printed copy. Overall, I was pretty happy with how it turned out, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and comments.
I've read your thesis and prepared my evaluation of it. Firstly, I will shortly summarize the thesis, then I'll go through it, and then I'll give my feedback on the strengths and weaknesses. Then you will have the opportunity to respond to my comments. I'll follow the structure of the thesis, starting with aims, methods, discussion and conclusion, and finally I'll comment on the entire thesis and its applicability to sociological knowledge.
Sounds fantastic.
You investigate why we was so much using mixed methods, surveys and action-based research. You draw on social practice theory to interpret your data and show ways that your findings relate to broader sociological understandings of the world. I found it easy to relate to your questions, and you actually made me think about how much I was my own genes. Did I miss anything?
No, that was a great summary, thank you.
Okay, let's begin. Your aim was to discover ways of reducing resource intensity in everyday life. More specifically, you were interested in ways that collective conventions shape social practices, looking at laundering.
Yeah, that was my final aim.
Were you clear about this aim from the beginning, or did it develop the further you got into the research?
Well, actually, when I started, I was more interested in sustainable fashion. But the further I got into the reading, the more I realized that the biggest environmental impact was in the use phase, how we wash and care for our clothes. So then I became more interested in use phase and, of course, people and the social meaning around cleanliness.
To address your aim, you have chosen a mixed method approach. You have gathered data through surveys, interviews, action research, and autoethnography. Could you reflect on how you found these methods work together?
I wanted to explore my research question from as many angles as possible. And to do this, I started with a survey to give a base kind of description of what was actually going on. And then on that, I wanted to get a little bit deeper and find out more about the meanings and understandings around cleanliness. And that's where the interviews and the autoethnography came in. I did end up with quite a lot of data, but I was able to organize it somewhat using in vivo software analysis. And that helped me also to kind of identify some of the different commonalities.
But why haven't you more actively incorporated your own experiences of wearing the jeans in your analysis and make yourself an object of investigation, observation and reflection?
That's a great point. I did keep a diary when I was doing the study, which I incorporated into my in vivo database. But you're right, I could have made that a lot more active in the discussion section.
And how did you develop your questionnaire?
To start off with, I looked at the Government Bureau of Statistics to find out what kinds of questions they were asking in similar research areas. And then from those questions, I developed some of my own to answer my own questions. I tested those questions on 10 of my classmates, and then I actually had to clarify them a little bit so they were easier to answer. And after that, I was ready to get going.
Okay then, when you went to analyze the data, why did you stop at univariate analysis. Couldn't further statistical analysis have helped you to explore your question? For example, it could have been interesting to compare the question, how often do you wash your jeans, with the question, how important is sustainability to you?
Yeah, that would have been super interesting, and I would have loved to do further statistical analysis given more time. And I guess at the same time, if I had have focused more on the quantitative data, I might have ended up in a whole new direction with a different thesis. As it is, the quantitative part lays the foundation for the further, deeper, qualitative investigation, which is more pertinent to the kinds of questions I ended up asking.
Your thesis is quite empirical. Do you think a more deeply developed theory section could have helped to improve the applicability of what you've written?
Absolutely. That's something I wish I'd spent much more time on instead of focusing so much on the empirics.
But you did relate your findings to social practice theory using Bourdieu and Giddens. How did you find your results fitted in with this framing?
When I first started writing my discussion section, I found it really hard to find any patterns, and it was a little bit all over the place. But after then going back to the theory and looking at my data with a lens of social practice theory, I found it much easier to identify patterns. Instead of looking at individuals, I looked at objects like jeans, washing machines and powders, skills, knowing when and how to wash, and social understandings like wanting to fit in and not wanting to offend colleagues. Social pressures became much more obvious, and I found it easier to identify ideas of what was normal and where they came from.
Moving forward to your analysis section, you find that people are washing because of social pressure rather than physical needs, and start exploring this idea of collective conventions. What do you mean by that?
In my interview, one thing I heard over and over again was that people weren't washing because of physical things like dirt or smell, but rather some underlying feeling that they should. People were actually washing quite a lot without being able to explain exactly how this added any benefit to their life. That made me think that there was some common denominator, some shared understanding about what people should do that had quite a lot of agency in what people did do.
Interesting, thank you. I've also made some small suggestions with the grammar and formatting, which I'll email to you. Overall, I found the flow logical, and your thesis was well written and engaging to read. Did you have any specific questions?
No, you've given me plenty to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, and all the best with your final edits.
We've just enjoyed a master thesis defense seminar at Lund University's Department of Sociology. Our opponent has just gone through the different parts of the thesis, highlighting their strengths and weaknesses. Our author responded to the opponent's questions and highlighted her own view of the thesis. At this point, we would normally pass the discussion on to the audience, giving them a chance to ask questions. In this very positive example, the opponent asked her questions in a way that was very structured and diplomatic, and she provided us with the context which showed us how answering those questions could improve this thesis. She also listened to the author's responses. The author showed us her very specific scientific reasoning behind her research choices. Her responses to the opponent were reflective, communicative, without being defensive. What we've seen was a professional discussion that was content-focused and helped everyone understand the scientific reasoning behind the thesis.